Okay, we'll continue now with our introduction. And I'm still waiting to get a hold of the introduction to Menachos. But in the meantime, just to finish up, if we can. Oh, I don't know if we'll finish, but getting closer to the finish point. First of all, there's a din of Balak carbon. He was Magdich a carbon. Or alternatively, someone else could be Magdich a carbon on his behalf. And the Ritzi carbon will be on behalf of the Bala carbon, or on behalf of the person for whom the carbon was brought. Now, after the Hakadosha, after he was Magdish the carbon, then you cannot change Bailam. There's no such thing as selling a carbon. Let's say, for example, I own a carbon Ola, which I was Magdish, or somebody was Magdish on my behalf. I can't sell it to you, or a carbon Shlamim. It means, and this is Sugim Psachim, there's no such thing as selling ownership on a carbon, because you don't really own it in the physical sense, like any other Chefetz Shel Mammon. All it is means that the kapara is, shall I say, singled out for you, and that kapara doesn't lend itself to sale. You can't transfer ownership of a carbon. Now, what does the Balak carbon have to get personally involved in? He doesn't do the avodos, but he does smicha. And smicha is derived from psukim in the Torah, and it's not likuva, it's a mitzvah. And also, in the case of Kodshim Kalim, he, the owner, gets to eat some segments of the basar, and it's his responsibility as the Bala Karban to see to it that the basar of Kodshim Kalim is eaten within the allotted time. So let's say for Shlomim, you have 2 days and 1 night. So the Balak Karban would be in violation of Nosar if he doesn't see to it that the basar was nechal, was given out to people to eat. Now let's move on to the Kohanim. The Kohanim do the avodah. We're talking about a Zachar Kohen, and he doesn't have any mum on his body. He is a tam. Now, a katan cannot perform the avodah. A zar is completely excluded from avodah sakarban with the exception of shchita. And shchita ksheira bizar, but in the case of an oath, where we need malika, there we require a kohen. Now, a non-kohen could be introduced for what we call hafshata, which he translates here as flaying of the hides of all karbanos. So that when we take apart the pieces of the animal, and let's say, for example, in the case of an ola, this kind of process could be done even by a non-kohen. Now, when we get to menachos, we'll have to talk about something called hagasha. And that takes place before kmitza. Once it's kmitza v'elef, you need a kohen. But hagasha, which means bringing the carbon to the mizbeach before kmitza, that could be done even by Yisrael. Of course, hagasha is not an amal. Now, we talk about avodas hakarban as being critical. An essential avoda means that without it, the carbon is completely hustle, it's invalid. Okay. Now, with regard to a zevach behema, we need zrika, we need shchita, kabbalas adam, holachas adam, and zrika. Kabbalas adam is in a klishares, and then there's olachas adam to the mizbeach. The murim are burnt on the mizbeach, and afterwards the meat of the carbon can be eaten by the kohanim, or in the case of shlomim, by the bailet. Ola, as we said, is completely kolil al gabi mizbeach, and the chatos hapnimis is brought outside Yerushalayim and it's burnt there. Okay. Now, we mentioned before smicha. Smicha is a requirement lechatchila as a mitzvah, but only with regard to a carbon yachid. As far as which parts of avodah are absolutely critical, those are called avodas hadam, that we mentioned earlier, the four avodas hadam. Any psul in any of the avodas hadam, the four that we mentioned, will disqualify the carbon. But as far as smicha is concerned, or even as far as haktaras ha'imurim is concerned, or achilas habasar, all these are not part of the avodas hadam. Hence, they are not absolutely critical. So, if, for example, the Baal HaKarban failed to do smicha, or if the murim for some reason got lost and became tameh, he wasn't able to be mocked to them, and the same is true for the basar, or if the Baal HaKarban doesn't eat the basar, the kohanim didn't eat the basar, in all that those cases, the carbon is kosher. But smicha is something that the Baal HaKarban should perform before the avodas hadam, before the shechita. He puts his hands on the head of the animal, and he leans forward with all his strength. He recites vidui over the carbon, a tosi, a sisi kach v'kach. He needs a karas hachet. He needs pirat hachet. And he adds a sentence that says, I have done tshuva before you. This is my kapara, Kodshim. And during the smicha on a carbon shlomim, or we spoke about Toda yesterday, then there's no vidu, because shlomim essentially is not a carbon for the sake of sin, for kapara. And therefore, at the moment of smicha and shlomim, the Rambam writes he should recite words of praise to Hashem. Very strange halacha of smicha. I mean, we generally identify smicha as vidu. We'll have it in this week's parsha. You know, in the Seir HaMishtalech LaZaza, you know, the Kohen recites a vidu al Shem Kol Yisrael, and then he sends it out to the midbar. Here in a carbon shlom, we have a whole different type of smicha. And the words that come out of his mouth when he is somech al karbanim, in the case of shlom, is not chatasi abisi masisi kach v'kach, but rather how great you are, O God. And it would seem, therefore, that smicha has a different function. It's to connect the bailim to the carbon. Now, there's something called a par heling davar shel tzibur, which means that the entire tzibur followed a mistaken ruling of the Sanhedrin. As a result, they have to bring a special chatos, which is called a par heling davar. In this case, there will be vidu, but who's going to recite vidu on behalf of the entire tzibur? And the Gemara establishes that there are three members of the High Court of Israel of the Sanhedrin. They will be designated to do smicha. And I'm inclined to think, although he doesn't write this, that they would recite vidu. Where do we find vidu on a korban tzibur? That we'll find on Yom Kippur. Now, we said before, smicha is only applicable to an animal. It has no application to birds. Okay, fine. Now, the shechita of Kodshim is identical with shechita of Chulin, and anything that would undermine the shechita of Chulin undermines, therefore, the shechita of Kodshim. And the main dam that has to be received in the klishores after the shechita is what's called the damat savor, that spurts forth from the neck of the animal. And then, as we said before, there's got to be after kabbalah sadam, ulachas hagam, and then zrika sadam on the wall of the mizbeach. Again, there's a different set of halachas for chatos, but in general, we need zrika as opposed to shficha. So we don't pour the dam onto the wall of the mizbeach, but rather we throw it from a distance. The exception might be Korban Pesach. He doesn't mention it. Now, there's something called shiurei adam. So once he did the zrikas adam, all the leftover dam is now subject to shvicha shirayim. And you pour the extra dam, the surplus dam, on the yesod hamizbech. Oh, he does mention Pesach here. I didn't see this. He says the Korban Pesach is an exception to the rule, and its blood is not thrown onto the wall of the Mizbeach, but rather it is poured onto the wall of the Mizbeach. So we could have written that. Now, what's the din of a chatos? We said that a chatos has its own dinim about zrika sadam. And now we'll talk about a chatos chitzona, just a classic chatos. Here, we have a din of karnos hamizbeach, not the kir hamizbeach, the wall of the mizbeach on the outside, but rather the corners, the horns of the mizbeach. Keren means horn. Now, there's another difference. Not only is the dam, the avodas hadam and chatos radically different, because on the chronos, on the gag hamizbeach, but also we have to add that it's not a matter of zrika of dam, sprinkling the dam, but rather it's applying the dam. He puts his fingers into the dam and applies them to the chronos of the mizbeach. Then we have something called a chatos pnimis. Like, for example, on Yom Kippur, we'll have a different kind of halach of dam, which is called hazah sadam. And that's going to take place in the Kodesh Kodshim. There'll also be, similar to a chatos, the rest of the year, there'll be an application of the dam to the chronos hamizbeach. Now, once the carbon is brought and the dam was done, the imurim are placed on the mizbeach for burning. And we said that that's not likuva. If the imurim contract tumor or get lost, the carbon is still kosher. However, what happens if the imurim got lost, and now the kohen wants to eat the part of the segment of the basar that he's meant to eat? The kohen may not eat their portion before the emurim have been burned. As long as the emurim are in existence and they haven't been burned, then there's no achilas habas. So the kohen may not eat their portion before the emurim have been burned, as long as there's a possibility of eating the Emurim are in existence. But if they're not in existence, then there's Achilas, Basar, Yidei Kodim, even without the Aktar Emurim. Now, what are the Emurim that have to be burnt on the Mizbeach? Are they the same for all animals and for all karbonos? Well, they seem to be the same for all karbonos minus the ola. Here's where the carbon ola stands out as being unique. We spoke about Zrikas Adam Vachatas as being unique. Okay. He says that the parts of the animal that have to be burnt on the Mizbeach consist of fats around the body cavity, fats upon the stomachs, kidneys, and flanks. And he has here a discussion about other parts of the animal, like, for example, the liver, the diaphragm, kidneys, the tail of a sheep. Now, there are very complicated dinim about where you're allowed to eat kodshim. And we learned some of this in Masechet Psachim. We have a principle in Psachim that kodim ochlim ubaylim iskaprim, which means that the achilas hakodim of the boss is part of the atonement, the kapara of the korban. And then there's an issue about the part of the korban that's eaten by the bailin. Is that a mitzvah? After all, it doesn't generate kapara. And they're certainly not allowed to leave the basar as nosar. They have to eat it within a certain period of time. Would there be a bracha, a special bracha of alachilas hazemach, in the case of Yisrael, who brings a korban shlamim and he eats the meat of kodshim kalim? And he says here that the owners did not have a mitzvah to eat the meat of the offerings that's permitted to them. Their obligation extends only to guaranteeing that the offering is eaten within a certain requisite period of time, but they can give it to anyone they want to eat. So he's contrasting Korban Pesach with all other korbanos where there's achilas bailim. And in Korban Pesach, the bailim are obligated to eat the basar, but not in Korban Shlamim. In Korban Shlamim, they can just simply invite whoever they want to eat the basar korban. So, for example, we have a mitzvah of eating matzah. It's not enough that you invite someone to eat matzah. You have to personally eat matzah. The mitzvah shebegufa. With regard to achilas basar kodshim, we don't find such a parallel halacha. Go ahead and feed the basar to someone else. It's not what we call a chovas gavra ma'isa achila, but rather it's a din in the chefza that it should be nechal. And whoever's going to eat it is going to be part and parcel of that mitzvah of making sure that it's a nechal. I'm not 100% sure that this is correct, by the way. I have a strong intuition that there are two dimensions to achilas basar kodshim. It's not only a din in the chefza of the basar, it's also a kiyum gavra. But he assumes not like that. Now, the meat of kodshim can only be eaten in the azar by zichrei kahuna. The meat of kodshim kalim could be eaten by anyone. So that what happens in Kodshim Kal? Kodshim, we said, like for example, Chatos or Osham, that can only be eaten by Kohanim in a Hazara. What about Kodshim Kalim? We said that in Shlomim and Toda, there's part that goes to the Kohanim that's called Chaz of Shok, and then there's part that goes to the Bailam. In the case of Shalmei Nazir, the Kohanim get additionally the right front leg. The Kohanim's chela can be eaten only by a Kohen and by the members of his household, his wife, his children, if he owns avodim. Now, once we finish up with the chaz b'shok, in the case of Shlom, which was eaten by the Kohanim, the balance of the korban and his basar is mutter to everyone. Both the Kohanim and the owner have to eat within the city of Yerushalayim, inside the chavos of Yerushalayim. A bechar is only eaten by the Kohanim. Meiser is only designated for the owner. And Pesach is designated for the Achilas Basar for anyone who signs up for the Pesach. He's registered. Meiser, a korban meiser, behema, is entirely the possession of the owner. Just like in the case of a chabura of a korban Pesach, that it's exclusively to the members who signed into that chabura. In Meiser behema, there's a similar halacha that the offering goes entirely to the Baal HaKorban. And this leads us to another section about Malika, about Chatas Of and Olas Ha'of. And that we'll leave for Ritzchem for tomorrow.